I was sitting last night in college hosting a visiting German classical archaeologist, very distinguished one from Berlin. And at one point he asked me what I was up to, and I said, I'm doing something about the portraits of Sappho. Silence from him for a moment as he chewed over this information. And then he said, waste of time. A cheery academic repartee going on. I think what he meant, I mean, I didn't press him. We moved on quickly to other topics. I think what he meant was if he understood by this quest, searching for Sappho, some definitive empirical attempt to find out what Sappho looked like. Of course, he was right. It is impossible, and I know that as well as anyone, to find the image of this poet, simply because she lived at a time when portraits were not commissioned, or they haven't survived, and the first image that we're going to see of Sappho, when we get to it, is not actually the first one that comes onto the screen, but the earliest one is at least 100 years after her supposed death. And so in that sense, it is a futile quest, searching for Sappho. However, what I want to do with the next 40 minutes or so is take you through what could be called a sort of history of wishful thinking, of what people have wanted Sappho to look like. And I guess we should start by just asking ourselves, why in particular her? And of course, part of the answer is that just the very fact of being a famous, some would say notorious, female poet makes her unusually interesting as a source of a kind of iconographic quest. You know, we single her out on those grounds. Anyone who knows anything about her poetry, and there are people in the faculty who know far more about Sappho's lyrical genius than I do, will know firstly that there's not a lot of it that has survived. There was once a good corpus of Sappho. 9 books of her poetry once existed. We know that it was treasured and venerated pretty much consistently throughout antiquity. So in the background to all the images that we're going to look at presently, I think you have to imagine that the Sappho is in the canon as far as archaic Greek poets go. But those who do know a bit about her verse will be aware that one of the aspects of it is that it appears to be of extraordinary candor. She appears to be a poet wearing, the phrase goes, wearing her heart on her sleeve. You know, her best known lyric, I guess, has this sentiment which I've had a stab at. It's sort of a translation and sort of a paraphrase. It's that situation, I'm sure many of you know it, where she's at some kind of social occasion, and the person that she wants to be sitting opposite is sitting opposite someone else and evidently enjoying themselves. And what does she say? When I look at you, one glance is all it takes. The gift of speech deserts me, as if my tongue were killed. A sudden blaze runs through and through my flesh. My eyes go dark. Waves crash in my ears. I'm both sweating and cold. I feel shaken and pale as grass. Is this what dying is like? So she sang of losing her voice, and in that act of losing all her poise physiologically, being overcome with desire for another woman, it's as if passionate paralysis became a strain of divine inspiration. I mean, without either demeaning Taylor Swift or Sappho, this kind of lyric, it seems to me and to many others, is it's got a very modern feel to it, and I think it feeds the desire to know, to want to know, what was she like? What should she look like? When you think how important it is for a singer these days to have a stage presence and a social media presence and an image that goes with some of these raw emotions that they are giving voice to. Now, in the background, in my this is actually an appropriated daughter who's left home but not quite abandoned her bedroom. You will see that there is, in fact, an image of Sappho on the wall. And it's the one, I guess, that most people, if they know any image that is called Sappho, will have come across, because it's kind of an icon of the Naples Archaeological Museum. And it's curious. It's always billed as Sappho, but I have not found any publication that argues the case that this is a representation of Sappho. That doesn't stop scholars and others using this as a sort of front cover for books about Sappho, translations of her work, and so on. But one of the curious things that immediately struck me as I started to began with this image and started digging around in the archives as to when it was first found, what it was thought to be. In all that research activity, haven't come across anyone making the serious claim that this is a representation of Sappho. So right away, you sort of come up possibly with what my German visitor was making a point about yesterday. You're immediately mired in this situation where it's almost an act of frivolity to sort of say, oh, this could be Sappho, that'll do, give her that title, without any kind of serious consideration. She was found taken away from a wall of a house in Pompeii. She was found in early excavations in Pompeii in 1760. One of the curious aspects, looking through the excavation records, is that the excavators thought it was a man to begin with. Took them a while to figure out that with this jewelry and that hairnet, it must be a female figure. As many of you knows this, and as you can see, I think from the image itself, it is a peculiarly arresting image, and it's still got this power, I think, to arrest you as you're walking through the halls of all the sort of the painted things from Pompeii that are in the big Naples museum. She catches your gaze and holds it. And of course, we're looking at her as she's in some action which involves a stylus and a block of 4 wax tablets. Now, check her out on Wikipedia, and essentially what you find is a kind of commonsensical account of her, which says, no, of course, this is not Sappho. This is some Roman woman, Pompeian woman, of around about the time of Nero. That's when her gold hairnet is thought to have been a fashionable accoutrement. And she's doing the household accounts. That's what she's doing. Now, I did trace where that came from. I'm very fond of Germany and its archaeologists, and I mean no disrespect by saying it was another German archaeologist, a guy called Ludwig Curtius, who around about the late 1920s made the case that this was a Roman housewife, a matron, who was totting up the household accounts. and so this kind of prosaic explanation, no Sappho here. It is a Roman matron possibly thinking, how many bottles of fish sauce did we get through last week? Do I need to order some more? And so on. I kind of didn't want that to be the case, and I'm pleased to say that I think the more that one looks at this and its context, the more one realizes that that Wikipedia entry is one that needs revising for a start. It's partly because in all poetic allusions to the actual craft and action of writing poetry in Horace and Ovid and others of the the period not long before this was created, the use of these wax tablets and a stylus, given the opportunity to sort of rub things out as you're going along, and even that gesture of holding the stylus to the lips, because you use one end for rubbing out and the other end for inscribing. Ovid talks somewhere about how, especially when you're doing love poetry, you're not quite sure of the words to use, so you're doing a lot of scraping out and rewriting and so on. Now, of course, that could be used for your household accounts, especially if you're into creative accountancy. But I think it's worth looking at who was found in the company of this figure. And on the same wall of the house, and I'm afraid I can't identify precisely which house, it's in the so-called Insula Occidentalis of Pompeii. It's let's call it the posh quarter overlooking the seaside of the town once upon a time. That it was a nice residential area of the town. And from the same house comes this image, which is often taken to be the partner of the woman depicted in our first slide. And you see he's holding a scroll, and that he's got a wreath on, a wreath of some kind of foliage. He is presenting himself as the prize winner of some kind of probably some kind of poetic competition, I think. And so it makes sense to me to see them as a pair, sharing this literary, let's say, pretensions, or they are reflecting their taste in the decoration of their domestic quarters. In between them was a scene of Perseus and Andromeda, suitably amatory in its nature, and the whole thing looks something like that, as has been reconstructed from the fragmentary evidence. And it's not really out of place to have such allusions to one's taste and literary ambitions in Pompeii. There are a number of other paintings. Quite often there's sort of tondo scenes with just one or two figures. There's also a very well-known image of a chap who appears to be a baker with his wife. He's often given the name of Terentius Neo. A house not very far away from where the so-called Sappho was found had this image in a library space, and you see there on the image on the right-hand side, there is an image of an archaic Greek poet, and there is a lyre there as well, as if to seal it. And in fact, the identity of the poet is inscribed as well. So it's kind of what you would expect from this. And I think what clinches it for me, and I could spend the next entirety of the session just talking about this image, but I do want to press on. But some more recently discovered, and when I say more recently, in the last couple of decades, and you'll be aware that there's a lot of new material coming up from Pompeii, and we're going to hear about it actually in the faculty in a couple of weeks' time from the director of excavations there. But in the Palestra Grande, the big gym space of Pompeii, they now have these wonderful paintings from a site just outside the main city, a place called Meregine, where in the dining room had all the muses were represented, and we think this one is Calliope. And you see she's holding wax tablets, she's holding the stylus to her lips in the kind of, what's gonna rhyme with this, or how do I get my metrical, how do I get everything in the right order, and so on. So I think that sense that it's a gesture of deliberation about the writing of poetry, not the writing of prosaic household accounts, suggests to me that this anonymous lady, we have no idea, and I think very little likelihood of ever getting any idea of her identity. Okay, because there's no lyre here, because of the Neronian hairnet, etc., let's accept that the intention of this image was not to represent the ancient Sappho. However, I think it does not rule out the possibility, and for me, the probability, that this is a female poet, would-be poet, or practicing poet in Pompeii, who, in projecting herself within the act of deliberating the writing of poetry, may very well be casting herself as another Sappho, emulating Sappho, and in a sense, Sappho is the only one she can emulate. Sappho is the touchstone in terms of the identity of being a female poet. We know that from references in Ovid and others. So if she wants to be, as it were, not mistaken for Sappho, but if some choose to say, oh, you could be Sappho, I think we may be quite close to the original intention of this image. I can hear this skeptical visitor from Berlin saying, oh, come on, this is pretty desperate. You're just saying a Roman woman wants to look like Sappho. This does not help us know what Sappho once looked like. Okay, so let's try and go back to some earlier images and create some precedents for what we're seeing from Pompeii in the first century of our era. Some kind of visual cult of poets occurs on Athenian vase painting in the last decades of the 6th century BCE. Some of these poets are male ones, and some of them we know were active in Athens, and as it were, providing models. And you see the name Anacreon here on the lyre, as it were, sort of creating cults for themselves by the way that they dressed, and so it wasn't just their lyrics that were gaining them fame. There was a sort of performative aspect to all of this, and it's in this context that we've got our earliest image that survives of Sappho, spelt out there, as you see, on this vase in Poland. But we know that it was created in Athens just about the same time as democracy is making its debut in the city. And it's what? I mean, nobody can date the life and times of Sappho with any precision, but this tells us that by 510 or so, she's commemorated. And how is she commemorated? Well, as a I'm going to say statuesque figure. That's perhaps not quite the right word here. She's got an ornate hairdo and is dressed in I mean, these are the garments of the day. If you look closely at the way she's holding her lyre, Beazley, who you may remember, those of you who did the art and archaeology options, you may have remembered the name of Beazley. Beazley didn't think much of this painter, but even he didn't notice that the painter appears to have given Sappho a very long thumb. Maybe she was a bit like Paganini, who had extraordinary long digits, and then 5 fingers. I don't think that. I think that's a painter's slip. The way that that has happened, or else I've misread the structure of the musical instrument here. But she's got her plectrum in one hand, as you see, and so this captures her in action. Those ringlets coming down from her, so her hair's sort of tied up, and then there's this, what are they called? Some people call them bangs, I think, coming down. They do occur on sculptural images that are given the name of Sappho. I just thought I'd show you one of those from a head that was carved much later, but possibly on the basis of a sculptural version of Sappho that was created around the same time as that vase painting. I've been hunting around for potential images. I mean, with that one, you know, the painter very clearly wants us to know this is not any woman playing the lyre. This is Sappho. This is one I've come across fairly recently and was signaled by a guy called Carl Sheffold some years ago. He was always very optimistic. Sheffold was very optimistic about spotting Sappho, even when there was no inscription. I think with here we've got some grounds on this factor of the ringlets and the tied up hair with hair escaping at the back does seem to be a feature that occurs later on in the sculpture, as you will see. But in the same optimistic spirit, I've been inclined to include images that, a skeptic will say this could be some courtesan who is skilled at the lyre. There are images also, I'm not going to show you any of these now for lack of time, but there are images of female figures, as it were, in a landscape, playing an instrument. And it may well be that where one art historian wants to see Sappho, it could be a muse that's being depicted. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But within, the early 5th century, we've got some wonderful pieces where it is made very clear that Sappho is an iconographic presence. And I think a bit more than that, she is becoming a character who, she occasions gossip, even though she's long gone. And also, I think, some mockery on the Athenian stage. Here, it's, I don't think there's any mocking intent. It's an enormous vase of, not quite certain how it worked. You see there's a spout at the bottom. Beazley thought it was some kind of device for dispensing wine that had been chilled or something like that. It looks a bit like a basket, and actually the sort of shape that would be associated with domesticity and female sort of stereotypical furniture, if you like. And here we have, they're named by the painter. This is a vase in Munich. And we know that the figure on the other side, there is Dionysus, and looking very much like Dionysus is the figure of Alcaios, fellow poet on the island of Lesbos, more or less coeval, some think, with Sappho. And there she is, and she's also labeled. Her expression, I've been sort of wondering about her expression. There are some sort of sounds of sound coming, signs of sound coming out of his mouth. If you ever get the chance to see this vase, which celebrated by the poet Rilke in one of his poems. But what do you make of the expression of Sappho? You know, the literary traditions basically create a dilemma for us, because from the testimonies from antiquity of various periods of time, there are some attributions. Indeed, one of them is to the poet Alcaios, attesting the radiant beauty of Sappho and her wonderful violet-colored hair and so on. But there's also a biographical record that she was of short stature, not particularly pleasing appearance, and somewhat swarthy. I can't remember what the Greek is for that, but I don't know whether this is an intentional sort of bit of caricature. I think more likely it is an allusion to a story that we pick up in sources from classical Athens, that there was some kind of not an altercation, but some recorded exchange between Alcaios and Sappho, where basically Alcaios says, I'm all tongue-tied, basically because I want to say something to you which would be rather shocking. And Sappho's, to paraphrase her reply, is, well, shame on you for even thinking about it. And I think this is possibly a painter trying to express the look on the face of Sappho, basically ticking off her fellow poet for making improper advances to her as a respectable married woman. This is the stuff of the stage, though, and I suspect there were things going on the Athenian stage that kind of lampooned the reputation of Sappho. But at the same time, what we've got going on, we're finding scenes of Sappho here as if looking at her own work inscribed before her, with various female companions about her. And this is, you know, alongside this, we get a series of sculptures which, for various reasons, are thought to be derived from attested statues of Sappho that are being put in library spaces. So, you know, libraries are becoming a phenomenon from the late 6th century on, in Athens and in other places. And libraries like to have images of authors, you know, so many of the images that survive of Homer would have been originally commissioned for that kind of space, you know, just sort of making you feel at home in a room full of scrolls. But we know from other sources that Sappho she's on the curriculum now, and someone who can be consulted in the libraries. And in terms of literary reputation, as far as I'm aware, and as I say, there will be colleagues who know more about this than I do, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't really suffer any kind of falling into disfavor. On the contrary, it just seems to get more and more consolidated as in terms of its technical virtuosity and its memorability. You know, people are quoting Sappho and they're learning the works of Sappho as exemplary. And so a corpus is being built up of images that, okay, it may seem a bit desperate. This is one because it was found quite recently, I've just put in. But you're getting a sense of the type here. We know that on Lesbos that there was a cult of Sappho established after her death. So what does that mean? It means there's a shrine that people who adore Sappho, and this could be adoration in all sorts of forms. People who adore Sappho, they can go, there'll be statues there, there's sort of memorabilia of Sappho, and the local towns are putting her image on coinage. If only, and we can see the lyre on one side of the coin. If only we had some clearer profiles of the poet, it might help us decide better, you know, how we are going to differentiate. I'm going to bring this one in. She's very prominent in the museum at Istanbul and very unambivalently labeled as Sappho there. But the context, she came from a site in old Smyrna, Izmir. It doesn't really help us. It's really only the sort of, you know, that factor of the complex hairstyle. And I don't know. I mean, the carving of the eyes means that this must be a relatively late date in antiquity. But I think you're getting the sense that it does rely on a certain intuition. This, if only it could be more objective, but there's an intuitive sort of sense. This is how a poet will look, and that's not very satisfactory. And we come back to a factor that's be rather depressing, that Sappho's image is, you know, it can look quite different from one image to another. Sometimes she seems to be quite libertine in certain aspects. But I think this is the most interesting one from antiquity, in at least in Roman times, part of the so-called underground basilica in Rome, which was it's thought to be some sort of Neo-Pythagorean meeting place. And can you see there, we have got Sappho, well, a female figure with a lyre, she's holding a lyre. She's being pushed by a winged Eros. And it's easier to see when you're in this basilica that she is basically coming off a cliff and into some water. And on the other side, there is Apollo welcoming her. And my reading of this is that it's not so much an image of the suicide of Sappho, about which more in a moment, but her apotheosis, because already Plato had saluted her as the 10th muse. So she's got to become a muse somehow. And I think what's happening in this image, this stucco relief, is the process whereby Apollo welcomes her to the company, and what other people call her suicide is really her apotheosis. And the last image I've been able to find of her in antiquity is from the wonderful terraced houses that were excavated by the Austrians not that long ago at Ephesus, where, as you see, there's a room with Apollo and all the muses, and right next to Apollo you will find the image labeled as Sappho. So, you know, by the 4th century, some of the people in Ephesus are turning to Christianity. Others are holding on to a company of muses in which Sappho is there as number 10. Now, that's a summary of the ancient material. Will you forgive me for going at a bit of a gallop now through what happens next? So I do want to leave some space for questions of this. So the summary of what happens next is that in terms of survival, I mean, some authorities believe that Christians deliberately burned the work of Sappho because of its erotic associations, and in particular, its homoerotic associations and content. I don't know what the evidence is for that. But basically, what went into circulation as far as medieval knowledge of Sappho was concerned was a text that is usually attributed to Ovid and gathered within his book of sort of fictive love letters, the Heroides, where he has a love letter, he crafts a love letter from Sappho written to a boy who's a very particularly good-looking boy she's fallen in love with. The boy does not reciprocate. Sappho gets desperate and throws herself off cliff tops in an island, not Lesbos, it's on the other side of the Mediterranean. I won't go into that, but what you get from Boccaccio and some of the 13th, 14th century summaries of this is the image of someone who was venerated as a poet still. In Boccaccio's list of noble women from antiquity, Sappho was a great poet, but she was a very unsuccessful lover. And here you see her teaching bearded old fellows how to do poetry. She's in a sort of, the chair of authority, teaching magisterially. In this image of a German edition of Boccaccio, I think what's going on is actually a sort of synoptic thing here, that here she is, Sappho, and Phaon, the boy that she wanted to love, and presumably his face is sort of saying, no. And there she is consoling herself with the lute. What had happened with Ovid's Heroides was that it was first translated into French, and the French translator cut out some crucial lines that were in Ovid's original, which we now know, they're there in the text of the Heroides as it's now printed. But these were the lines of Ovid's letter in which Sappho basically says, I've given up loving girls, I renounce, and she reels off a list. It's a boy that I'm interested in. And crucially, that reference to her lesbianism, as we would now call it, was cut out of the medieval transmission of the Sappho biography. And so what you get are a series of images that show the unhappy lover about to end it all. And this has a big effect, as we shall see in the later history of this imagery. En route, and I'm just including this as something that's, it's well known, but also rather enigmatic. We would love to know what Raphael knew about the reputation and the story of Sappho when he chose to include her in his vision of Parnassus, where maybe he knew that she was one of the muses. He's foregrounded her and given her a label. Some think this is her letter to the hapless youth, and an allusion to her sort of unhappiness there. No, but she's in there with some of the great Italian, with Dante, etc. And so she's the only sort of, apart from the muses, she's the only female great writer chosen to appear in this company. And I think that alas, Raphael did not leave his reasoning for all of this. But moving on in a series of rapid movements, I'm afraid, Angelica Kaufman, subject of a show in London that I haven't yet seen. Quite a lot is known about her time in London, and it was from the point of view of affairs of the heart. It was not a happy time for her, and she basically paints herself as Sappho, including citations of Sapphic poetry. And that becomes, because Kaufman was very adroit at getting her work reprinted and sort of mass-produced. It puts out this sort of image of the disconsolate Sappho, which is sort of then picked up in, I mean, this, I think you'll be glad that I'm going so quickly through this material from the 18th and 19th centuries. It's mostly, well, some would say it's pretty nauseating. It's sort of semi-sanitizing Sappho as emblematic of love generally. But to think that, you know, Victoria and Albert exchanged statues of Sappho in the early days of their marriage. As far as I'm aware, neither of those worthy individuals was aware of her homosexual association. So effectively had she become, as it were, picked up to be any kind of symbol of passion and yeah, eros, in a sort of Victorian sanctified, purified way. And this rather morbid cult of, you know, the romantic agony of Sappho is what dominates the 19th century record. You know, she's on a cliff top, about to end it all, and various artists just really wallow in all of this. Gounod creates an opera that dramatizes it. And in all of this, the associations with Sappho's female lovers that we know about from her poetry, it's all, as it were, kept out of view and edited out. This fellow, Lawrence Alma Tadema, if you can read Greek, he's basically saying, you know, with a nod, Simon Goldhill, who those of you listening may like to know, he's still a force to be reckoned with in and around the faculty. Simon has written very insightfully about what is going on with the painter and the various expressions on the faces of the female audience here, and the names that are given to their to the appointed seats, listening to this recitation by Alcaeus. Check what Simon's written about this, but it's sort of the first intuitions that we're going to get of something that had already, in a covert way, started to appear in the early 19th century as knowledge of Sappho's poetry extended, and the Heroides were, you know, restored to their Latin original, the sense that there had been, you know, Sappho was a lover, possibly even a teacher as well, of some kind of clique on the island of Lesbos. And it's very poignant that it was actually a male homosexual who eventually was arraigned by the authorities for what were then misdemeanors, who left this most explicit record of Sappho in action on Lesbos. That was in a private collection that then became better known in the 20th century. But you have to wait really until the 1960s and 70s for Sappho then to be picked up by the gay rights movement and That's really as far as I intend to take the story. I put the manuscripts in the Egyptian desert, continue to be a source of further knowledge about Sappho. But I'm going to switch myself off now, James, and have left not very much time for questions, forgive me, but do we
No,
have any? Do we have any?
well, we do, and please carry on adding to the questions in that box. One thing that people would like to hear a bit more about, Nigel, is if the images you've shown us seem to vary in terms of some of them are kind of emphasizing Sappho as a singer or performer, while others have a kind of more textual Sappho. I mean, Sappho as a writer, like the one you've got here. I mean, what obviously, you know, that distinction would not have made much sense in archaic Greece, presumably. But do you see any kind of difference between presentations of her as a poet in the sense of, chewing the end of your stylus, deciding what to write, versus holding the lyre and singing, as it were, to an audience?
Um, I mean, I think the early images, they're on they're on pottery that is associated with, an institution, the symposium, which is not only an institution about drinking together, but it is an occasion, it's an erotic occasion. In a sense, I think that's setting up a bit of a false dilemma for us. I mean, her poems were performed,
Mm.
um, and is she the one who's accredited? Well, it's either her or Alcaios is credited with the invention of the plectrum, but there's a sense that uh, she's not doing this in private. It's not some sort of secret that is then revealed to the world, but it's that she's part of a repertoire that can be performed by others. Yeah.
But that would be, I mean, her presence at a symposium would itself be kind of interesting, wouldn't it? I mean, as a female
Yeah. Yes, because usually
present.
the females at a symposium were hetairai.
Enslaved, yeah.
Yeah, but they were not respectable females. And I think some of the stories about her were that she had sort of drinking clubs of women, which would have given rise to a lot of male ribaldry, I think.
Mm. Mm.
Personally. Yeah.
So another question we've had is, so a lot of the transmission of our classical authors comes not just through the kind of Western tradition, but also through Arab scholars and so on. Have you found any interest in Sappho or representations of Sappho in Arabic material or material beyond Italy and Greece?
Oh, what a good question. I mean, some of Sappho's sentiments, apart from sort of you could relate them to things like the Song of Solomon, but I think there are, strains of Arabic literature which are similarly sort of,
Mm.
highly expressive. But I'm not aware of any images that go with that from Arab sources. And I think I would be surprised if any did ever exist. But I might be wrong. But that's a good point. I must confess I haven't much thought about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So and the again the kind of the I may have missed this, but just for my benefit. So when you said there was a kind of, it seemed to me there was a kind of shift, or perhaps even an increase in interest in depictions of her through the 19th century.
there's a massive material, really a huge amount. Uh, and yeah, as Simon
Yeah,
commented, it's kind of quite difficult to deal with it because it's kind of all the same, and because we know what we know about Sappho, and because um, you know, LGBT
mm,
plus has made such a difference, I think, to the way that Sappho is received and read today, even compared to even just 25 years ago. I would say. Um, yeah, the 19th century sort of sentimentality. It sounds rather cliched to say that, but the way in which he just becomes, you know, sort of rather soppy version
yeah.
of passion that.
But
And
I mean, it's not her actual poetry is not sort of easy easy to come by, right? I mean, actually reading the original Greek, and I mean, when were editions of it becoming more and more accessible?
um, I'm going to say around about the second half of the 19th century, but I think
Mm,
for um, I mean this um, artist, despite Anne Louis sounds like it's a female artist, but it's not. It's a male artist who, as his biographies say, with that kind of winking way, he never married. It's basically that male homosexuals are aware of Sappho's homosexuality, and so it's this artist in
mm,
France, and then Simeon Solomon, who, as I said, was actually prosecuted for what were considered homosexual offences, that commit themselves to making it overt
right.
in a way that, as Simon has pointed out, Alma Tadema, he's kind of nudging you. What do you make of the? Do you know about these names and which fragments of Sappho they refer to? So there must be, at least amongst the literati. Oh yeah, we do know what she was all about.
Good. And then, can you take us back to the woodcut of Boccaccio that you showed us? Where you, yes, this one. So, someone's kind of perhaps been googling or just has is kind of eagle-eyed. The Latin at the bottom there, lesbia quid docuit, that's from the Tristia apparently. So I wonder. It seems like, as well as the Heroides, they must also have been looking elsewhere in Ovid for little bits. And I think what it says is, what did Sappho from Lesbos
Yeah,
teach girls other than to love?
yeah,
So I mean that seems to be the idea, I suppose.
yeah.
Um, Also, I mean maybe this isn't unusual. How many spellings of Sappho have you spotted across certainly through antiquity? It seems like P's and Phi's are kind of flying about all over the place.
They are, aren't they? And that first one, uh, yeah.
What's the first character? Is that another Phi?
Well, it does look like it, doesn't it? Yeah.
So it's for Sappho,
Sappho. Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, I imagine someone will tell us about someone we could ring up someone and then tell us about pronunciation and
I
all.
mean, is it, yeah, and is it just me that sees a very long thumb and five fingers there, or is there something I'm not looking at
Yeah,
properly?
oh, in the strings of the lyre, you mean?
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure those are fingers. I mean, could they be something that was attached to the back of the lyre? Are they feathers or something like that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, if that's a hand, it looks peculiar. You're quite right.
yeah.
Um, and what's she holding? Is it a plectrum on a
Yes,
string?
yes, yeah. So she doesn't drop the plectrum, I think.
Right. That's marvelous. Um, Good. I'm just checking to see if there's anyone else with a question that you can drop in. So tell me how this project's going to develop from here, Nigel. I mean, how far are you going to pursue it? Is the idea to take a kind of long sequential look through antiquity and through to modernity?
Well, as I think my German visitor um, would appreciate, that the story gets more interesting if you take it
Yeah.
as the long view, because it's about changing perceptions, and it's about, in a history of wishful thinking, what is it that we wish to see in the figure of Sappho? And I think in the light of, you know, um, the way in which that perception has changed, in particular in the 20th, 21st century, makes it a story that it's too good, really, just to keep within an entirely sort of ancient perspective.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And I think also, I don't think I'm making this up, that there is a tension in the ancient images about, do they want to show Sappho as someone who was, you know, whether through gossip or something more substantial, associated with same-sex love.
Yes, that seems to be a constant um, question for all of these people.
Yeah, I mean, does an image like that, where she is, in the company of women with her lyre and her scrolls, are we supposed to read these as some of the known female lovers of her poetry?